Russia is stalling, and not just in negotiations. Just why is Russia still falling just a little short of those big battlefield victories they keep claiming to be inflicting? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. If you wear body armor, you already know not all plates are created equal. Today's sponsor, RMA Armament, isn't some Chinese drop shipper. It's not a rebrand of some manufactured overseas armor. It's American-made armor, made by people who know what it means to put your life behind it. The founder is a Marine Corps vet and former law enforcement officer who named the company after his kids because, as we know, the whole point of body armor is to get you home safe to your family. They've been making armor for over a decade now in a 30,000 square foot facility in Iowa using American-made materials and 100% American labor. I actually picked up their XRT plate in the Sappy cut. You notice this is thinner than anything I was issued by the US military in Afghanistan and significantly lighter. But the best part is that this, despite being so much lighter, is rated against almost every mid-size cartridge, almost every full-size standard issue rifle round, and even some armor-piercing rounds. It's made of ceramic, so you're not going to have to worry about spall, and it's available in shooter's cut and Sappy. RMA has body armor from level 3 soft armor all the way up to level 4 rated plates. Bottom line, RMA is doing it right. An American company, American made, built by people who understand what it means to put your life behind your body armor. So hit the link in the description, check out the catalog and videos. They've got some sales, and see why RMA is called the King of Armor. Okay, so I want to point out that, first off, Russia loves to tout what it claims is its decisive victories in Kupiansk. And while you may point out that it does appear to indeed be the case that the Russians have managed to cross the Oskil and just creep their way right into downtown Kupiansk, so they can technically say, yes, Russian forces have taken downtown Kupiansk. But you can see this is really stretching credibility in general, given that, again, you're looking at a basically narrow, tiny Russian advance, literally occupying 3 blocks. No, not even 3 blocks. 2 blocks thick of the city. Make it just down to the city center with the Oskil at their back. And I can tell you, these are not Russian soldiers that I would want to be. Now, you can see Russians also conducting a similar infiltration on the western side of Kupiansk here. But nobody's going to look at this and say that the Ukrainians are encircled in Kupiansk, okay? I want to make that as clear as possible. There's almost no scenario where this is the case. Now, don't get me wrong. This Oskil is tough to cross, and there's somewhat limited bridging options. But as we've pointed out, logistics in this war are just have a different character to them at this point, right? The restriction is not the ability to drive across a bridge. That's important to get troops to and from a place, but the restriction is more about drones, right? The ability of drones to get to and from a position. So the idea that the Russians are going to gain some tremendous advantage by being on one side or another of a relatively small stream is just not really all that credible anymore. And that's not the only place where we've seen Russians just stall out entirely. In fact, the real Russian stall out is in Mirnohad. Now, we're going to go back in time here and observe the fact that even as we move back in time, while Russian forces are making advances, this is a far cry. This is, let's take it back to the first of the month. So here we go. Here's the 1st of November. And as you can see, Russian forces, while they are trying to do this encirclement in Pokrovsk, they're not actually doing the whole encircling thing. Right? You can see Mirnohad slowly advancing, but crucially, the part that makes this efficient is the circle part of the encirclement, right? Where you turn it into a circle. And as you can see, even by the most generous interpretations, while some Russian troops are operating really close in here, you can see that really, in terms of areas of decisive Russian ground control, they're still looking at 7 kilometers from point to point, nearly 5 miles from Russian force to Russian force. So this is a pretty actually wide gap, given the fact that, as we've seen, Ukrainian troops really are seeming to be conducting a gradual withdrawal. See, the encirclement will work is if you see Ukrainian control and Russian isolation here, but I don't think that's really the case. Instead, what we're seeing is, again, a slow Russian advance and a gradual Ukrainian retreat. And this is happening quite slowly, at, again, almost a glacial pace, which is a sign, I think, that the Russians realize that more troops isn't going to speed this up. You could see Ukrainians here trying to continue to push back, particularly trying to relieve pressure on this Mirnohad encirclement through this northeastern salient here, right? There, the strategy in Ukraine seems to be largely to try to keep the Russians on their toes from controlling this decisive piece of terrain here, giving their troops a chance to withdraw through a more northern direction. It's not a crazy plan, but I think the big takeaway is, again, that the Russians really, really want this to be true. And we talked about the fact that in late October, the commanding commander-in-chief of the Russian Armed Forces, Gerasimov, briefed Vladimir Putin that these two towns, Pokrovsk and Kupiansk, were fully encircled, that the Ukrainians there were cut off. In fact, they often said there were 18 to 20 Ukrainian brigades there, which is preposterous. That's, there might be conceivably 18 to 20 brigades maybe deployed in the general area, and perhaps a handful of troops from each might be located in this pocket. But even that's being pretty generous. The idea that there's tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops in this pocket, probably almost certainly not true. We just know that because the battlefield is not dense with troops. There is no area of the battlefield where troop densities are that high. Period, full stop, end of story. And you can see when we look over at the other map, the situation in Kupiansk looks even more sort of janky. You can see, yeah, this shows Russians kind of maybe depicting them as having more control over this area here. But again, what nobody is going to argue is Kupiansk troops are encircled. It's just not the case. And nobody's really, it's even less apparent in places like Pokrovsk and Mirnohad. This does depict it as being a somewhat narrower area, but you can kind of see the situation the Russians are in. Ukrainian troops potentially encircled in Mirnohad, but Russian troops also kind of equally encircled in this salient here, sort of stuck out in the open near Rodensk. It's a very bizarre situation, but again, it is in no way, shape, or form should be in no way, shape, or form confused for an encirclement. Now, this isn't the only area where Russian forces are using stalling as a strategy, right? Unfortunately, while their attacks are stalling, they're also stalling in their negotiations. And this is critical to the Russian strategy because despite the literal vice president of the United States coming out and saying sanctions don't work, the U.S. sanctions on Russian oil companies, Lukoil and Rosneft, literally have only been in effect 4 days. So it's really, really kind of preposterous to sit there and say, oh, sanctions don't work. Again, the current trading price of the Russian stock market would beg to differ. Here's the 12-month chart. You can see that Russian stocks really peaked in value around 3,000 rubles. This is their version of the S&P 500. And since then, they've been getting absolutely just hammered. And remember, over the last 12 months, you might say, well, they're kind of neutral. But remember, the ruble has lost up to as little as 9%, as high as maybe even 75% of its value. You can see here, again, bear in mind, this is indexed to the ruble, which every year has been losing 25% of its value. This is the trend of a stock market. Again, if you were to denominate this in dollars, this trend would be even further downward. So this is sanctions. For someone who says sanctions don't work, sanctions are working. And this is why the Russians are playing these kind of stupid games around peace deals, right? They rolled out, again, essentially a Ukraine surrender deal. And now that the Ukrainians and Americans and Europeans are inking their own proposal, the Russians are saying, listen, we're open to talk, but you've got to make sure that basically he says Russia's position has not changed and is not going to change, saying we consistently adhere to this position, which is, as we've pointed out, the vassalization and subordination of Ukraine to the Russian Federation, turning Ukraine into a colony of the Kremlin. Right. And I think this whole, this is just a stall tactic. It's very transparently obvious, right? Russia repeatedly puts forth what they claim are sincere peace deals, oftentimes with, as we point out, just absurdly unacceptable terms. Remember, Russia's peace deal also involves NATO actually altering its founding constitution to become a closed membership state, prohibiting any nation in the Russian orbit from ever having a hope of joining NATO. And this is important for Russia because what they can do is go to countries like non-NATO countries like Moldova and say, hey, Moldova, NATO's never going to become a member of you. And there's an 800,000 strong Russian force on our border. So either you become a Russian vassal state, or we fight a war of annihilation against your people, right? And they can be certain that NATO will never come to help them now or in the future. So this is the core Russian strategy, is the defeat of NATO. And the fact is that the Russians are never going to diplomatically get NATO to surrender like that, despite the White House's best efforts. And so this whole talks thing is probably just a stall tactic by the Russians in order to get the sanctions to the White House to stop implementing this round of sanctions. It's transparently obvious to everyone, again, except for J.D. Vance and Donald Trump. So it's the Russians being Russian. But the problem is, as we pointed out, it doesn't actually seem to be working. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thanks to GMAC Club, Henry Ruscio, James Porsche, Paul, Peter Fucci, as well as all of our Lieutenant tier members. We could not do this without you guys. I appreciate you all so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.